to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am joined by my fabulous co-hosts Rick Lee and David Gunkel. And today we are speaking in praise of instrumentality with a guest, who we will tell you about in just a second. But before we do that, I want to go around the horn here and get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Rick, let me go to you first.
I am drinking a Boulevardier and ranting about landlord-controlled heat. I haven't been in an apartment in years and years where the heat is not controlled by a thermostat in that apartment. I'm away from home, and the first 2 days I was in this apartment, it was freezing cold, and then the heat came on, and the heat came on, and the heat came on, and the heat is still on, and I don't think I could record this podcast naked. So let everyone control their own heat.
Amen to that.
Lee, as you mentioned, today we are joined by a good friend of ours and a friend of the podcast, Dimitris Vardoulakis. He's someone with whom I've had many drinks in many hotel bars, non-hotel bars, friends' houses, and so on. Dimitris doesn't consider these kinds of conversations that you have over dinner or drinks or coffee to be frivolous or non-serious chats. We've talked a lot of philosophy in just these contexts, so he's a perfect guest to join us here in our hotel bar. He's associate professor of philosophy at Western Sydney University, and he's the author of tons and tons of essays and a lot of books. So let me just mention his most recent books, which are relevant to what we're talking about today. Spinoza the Epicurean, Authority and Utility and Materialism, published by our friends Edinburgh University Press. And The Ruse of Techne, Heidegger's Magical Materialism, just hot off the presses from Fordham University Press. And I know I have an inside track on this. He's recently completed a manuscript on what he calls agonistic politics. So a lot of his recent work really is a series of books dealing with aspects of the problem we're discussing today. The ethics and politics of what he calls the ineffectual and the disastrous consequences it has for contemporary political theory and ethics. Dimitris, welcome to the bar, and we want to know, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Oh, I would love to have a straight bourbon, Woodford Reserve Double Oak.
Nice, nice.
They pay you well in Australia.
I did discover the pleasures of bourbon in the US. I've spent a bit too much time in your country. I was going to rant about the US and US politics, which is very upsetting to look at from outside the US at the moment.
We are too.
Yeah, we are too. So, David, what about you? What are you drinking?
I'm going to have my new favorite shot, which is the Fuck Putin shot, discovered in the beer station in Warsaw. Bottom layer of a yellow liqueur called Advocat, and then blue Caraco on top. It tastes like hell, but it's got the best name. And I will be raving about people who read books on public transportation. I ride the L a lot, and I always have a book with me and I'm reading, and I locked eyes with someone across from me also reading, and we had this great conversation about how no one reads on the L anymore. And we looked around, and indeed it was the case. And I will say that when I get on the L and someone is watching a video on their phone and I have to listen to their audio and I'm trying to read, it absolutely pisses me off. So reading is now the OG of public transportation entertainment, and I want to just celebrate it.
Nice.
Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I'm just going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace with A-Rock. And today I am raving about another podcast that I just discovered that's called How to Do Everything. So the basic premise of this podcast is that they ask people how to do things that maybe most of us know about but don't really know how to do. Some of these people that they ask are celebrities. Like they ask, for example, Tom Hanks how do you act when you get a 15-minute standing ovation like frequently happens at the Cannes Film Festival, and they ask Nick Offerman, how do you cure the hiccups? But then there are other things that I've just found totally fascinating, like, you know how you see these restaurants, Rick's world famous hot dogs or David's world famous pizza. How do you become world famous? Like, how do you know that you are actually world famous when you're claiming that? So I highly recommend this podcast. It's just really entertaining. It's called How to Do Everything. So, as we mentioned, Dimitris is here with us today to speak in praise of instrumentality. But Rick, why don't you set this conversation up for us?
Well, it seems that common sense tells us that most, if not all of what we do in order to accomplish something other than that action itself. Like we eat to nourish ourselves and to stay alive. We drink in order to get drunk and receive some kind of pleasure. We tell lies in order to get out of sticky situations and so on. But in the 20th century, a number of philosophers, and we could name a few of them, Martin Heidegger, Emmanuel Levinas, Giorgio Agamben, they've come to criticize what philosophers call instrumental action, and they've celebrated those actions that are done for their own sake. Like, I play tennis, but I don't do it to get healthy. I don't even play it to win or experience pleasure, but I play it simply in order to play tennis. And those actions that seem to inherently have no end, by the way, thinking is the preeminent of these, they come to be valued precisely because they accomplish nothing. If we look at our natural world instrumentally, we're tempted to use it for some purpose other than itself, and therefore we can use it up, and we don't have any regard for it being a value in itself. But if we push this critique of the instrumental too far, we come to have an ethics that I would say is in itself not effectual. Now, there's an Italian expression, dolce far niente, sweetness and doing nothing. But should this be taken as a universal moral law for all? Or should we take another look at the importance of doing something? That is, acting to accomplish something other than acting. So, Dimitris, I mentioned in the introduction that some philosophers, primarily in the 20th century, maybe slightly earlier, criticize or maybe devalue the kind of action that is taken for some end that is outside of the action itself. But I also mentioned that common sense seems to tell us that the reason why we act is in order to accomplish something. So I was wondering if you first might tell us how philosophers came to criticize the fact that we act in order to accomplish something outside of acting.
Well, I think a very significant factor here is to remember that something is forgotten in the way that instrumental action has been described in the so-called critique of instrumental reason, which includes Heidegger, includes the Frankfurt School. Like a very good summary of the critique of instrumental reason is the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer. And the argument that they make there is that every kind of technical action, every kind of instrumental action is connected with structures of power, and these structures of power use that instrumentality for their own benefit. That is, to perpetuate their power, to prevent political change, to prevent any kind of social and ethical benefit other than the benefit of those powers they're espousing. A further critique of instrumental reason is that when that instrumentality unfolds for the benefit of certain powers, not only does it prevent political change and prevent us to act ethically, in addition, it leads to violence because instrumentality is inherently violent. Now, I agree with all that. I have no problem with all that. My only problem is to say that if we look at the tradition of philosophy, we usually have two notions of instrumentality. One, to use the vocabulary of Aristotle from Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, there is an instrumentality that is called techne, and is characterized by having specific ends which are measurable and independent of the person who is acting with specific ends in mind. And there's a different notion of instrumentality, which Aristotle calls phronesis, which is acting for the good, where the good is not defined as individual good, is defined as the good of everyone who is involved in the process of judging how to act, the ends and the means of action. And further, this instrumental kind of acting and judgment that they call phronesis, the ends can never be defined with absolute certainty. It's the good in general. And the means also can never be certain. So my critique of instrumental reason is partly a historical one. What happened to phronesis is being completely forgotten. That's one part of it. The second part of it would be, well, what happens if we adopt the idea that we can have actions that are good in themselves? Where do they come from? What are their effects? That's where I think these actions, which in continental philosophy are mostly described in terms of the event or some kind of art that gives us a more ethical or political insight into our predicament, these actions don't seem to me to have any particular effect in reality, and I lament that. Then my question is, what happens if contemporary thought remembers again that notion of phronesis, which is the other notion of instrumentality? How would that inflect our notion of the ethical and the political?
It seems to me, though, that in your discussion of phronesis, you also leave out some kind of instrumentality that might be crucial. This is both a historical point and maybe just a larger point about human action and ethics. Yes, Aristotle does argue that everything we do aims towards some end which is considered to be good. And then his problem is, yeah, but there must be an ultimate good, right? Because if every action just aims at a good, and that good aims at a good, and that good aims at a good without end, then we would never act on the basis of a good at all. And so there has to be an ultimate end. But he never gives up the fact that I eat in order to nourish myself. I take medicine in order to be healthy. That's one good. And yes, my being healthy might be in order for me to achieve another good, and that might be in order to achieve another good. But I wonder if you give up a little bit too much this, what could I call it, this internal or mini instrumentality. That, yeah, I do things for the sake of an end that is outside of its action. That I take to be good, even though that's working toward another good, and then therefore the ultimate good.
Oh, absolutely. And I agree with that reading of Aristotle. But in a sense, my point is, can we say a different notion of instrumentality other than the instrumentality criticized by the critique of instrumental reason? And it seems to me even the summary that you do of Aristotle points to that. And the second point, which is a historical one, is to say what has been forgotten by forgetting that notion of phronesis. And pointed to it with reference to Aristotle for expedience here, but we can have other references. But it seems to me that there is what I call a phronetic tradition that operates over the centuries and gives very different articulations of this idea of phronesis. So, for instance, the Epicureans completely abandoned the idea of the ultimate end that we find in Aristotle. Or another example would be Spinoza. I mean, I read Spinoza in my Spinoza the Epicurean as a significant example in early modernity of constructing an ethics and a politics based on the phronetic tradition. And again, in Spinoza, you remember, for instance, the conclusion to Book 1 of the Ethics, that notion of an ultimate telos is completely rejected. So I'm not trying to say that there is one phronesis or one idea about phronesis that is the correct one or anything like that. I'm really interested to unearth, to use Althusser's terminology, underground current of the phronetic tradition and find different articulations of it, because the contemporary discourse has completely ignored it. And when the contemporary discourse talks about instrumentality, it seems to me that only refers to the notion of phronesis, and that makes the description of experience a little bit poor.
So I'm just going to ask us to pause for a minute, because we've already been mobilizing the idea of the phronetic tradition and phronesis, and we may have listeners who don't know the phronetic tradition and don't know phronesis. And I'm wondering if we can maybe lay that out a little bit in large ideas or brief characterizations so that people know what is actually being mobilized here.
Just first starting with, if you've never heard the word phronesis before, it's spelled Phronesis. So that's what we're talking about. And as Dimitris said, most people trace it back to Aristotle, but there is a larger tradition in which the concept of phronesis is operative. But okay, I'll let you go, Dimitris.
And I should mention also, when I say phronetic tradition, I don't mean frenetic tradition, because I had students writing essays about the frenetic.
Oh, like with an F, like scurrying around tradition.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
Like a squirrel.
The phronetic has nothing to do with the frenetic,
Yes.
Matter of fact, the image of the ancient sage who has tranquility is someone who has phronesis. So phronesis, in a sense, is the opposite of the phronetic. But the idea is that phronesis, according to Aristotle, and I think according to most ancients, we find the same idea, both in Epicurus and Plato, phronesis is the primary ethical and political virtue. And what they mean by virtue is a kind of action that has effects. And in order for an action to have effects, that kind of action, according to the ancients, has to have a consideration of certain means and ends. So phronesis is a virtue that considers the effects of actions. And these effects of actions have certain ends, but the end of phronesis in itself is the good. But the good can never be determined with certainty. So it's a kind of instrumental thinking that I think we do all the time in our everyday lives. I've been able to describe that kind of instrumental thinking to my sons, well, when they were younger. Whenever we act, we don't necessarily act with a specific end in mind. I might be making a meal for my family and the specific end is to put the meal on the table, but there is another broader end, which is the well-being of my family, the good relations with other members of the family because I cater for them and that kind of thing. So it is this kind of insight that alongside the ends that we can specify very precisely, our actions carry a certain instrumentality whose ends cannot be specified with precision. That's the notion of phronesis.
Could you tie that just a little bit to the importance that Aristotle places on phronesis as a kind of habituation? Because I think that often when we think about instrumental thinking and the way that you've been discussing is often criticized in the contemporary continental tradition, among others, we think about it as a form of reasoning, a way of getting from point A to point B, and it leaves out the necessity of experience at all, which does seem to be absolutely central to the notion of phronesis.
In fact, I would argue it's absolutely central to the notion of phronesis, the experience we undergo in order to make a phronetic judgment. Again, Aristotle is very good on that, and maybe other ancient authors would have been very good on that as well, except it's only in Aristotle's work that a long discussion of phronesis has survived. In all other authors, there are, by the way, reference, but no systematic discussion, hence why Aristotle is so important. But the notion of phronesis in Aristotle, in Epicurus and later, is situated kind of knowledge. In fact, in the book on ancient Greek philosophy, I call it queer in the sense that phronesis is a calculation that arises out of our response to given circumstances. In that sense, it's a performative judgment. It doesn't have a telos that is an absolute telos. It doesn't have a calculation that can be absolutely certain. It is how you respond to the circumstances with an eye to achieve the good. So it is totally situated. That's the fundamental idea of phronesis. So from that point of view, a lot of the contemporary discourses like, for instance, queer studies, would be very much working in a kind of phronetic tradition in my terms, even though they do not know that, and even though these discourses tend to not be interested in the history of philosophy in that underground, the phronetic tradition that I'm referring to. But that emphasis on the situatedness is very, very significant on the performativity.
Hey, hotel barflies. We're not just sitting here sipping on cocktails and sharing stories. We're also bringing you extra fun on Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, and YouTube. That's right. Follow us on Facebook for all the latest updates, behind-the-scene peeks, and some serious cool posts. Or follow us on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, where you can enjoy our witty banter and updates. Drop us a tweet or join the conversation with other listeners. And don't forget about our YouTube channel, where we share all of our episodes. So if you're ready to help us keep the bar open past last call, hit that like button or follow and subscribe. It's like getting VIP access to all things hotel bar sessions. Thank you for all your support, and remember, whether you're on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, we've got a seat at the bar just for you.
Following from Lee's emphasis on experience and the role, and one might even say necessity, of experience for phronesis, this leads to a distinction I hear you making, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a distinction between calculation, which always belongs to instrumental reason, and judgment, which I want to say knows something, right? Judgment has a certain kind of knowledge, but it's not quite the same, as you were pointing out, with calculation. I might not know all the effects that my action is going to have. I don't maybe even know all the ends that I'm in fact striving for while I'm performing this action. But it's not like I don't know anything. It's not like, I'm shooting in the dark. And so it seems to me that what goes along with your emphasis on phronesis is a robust notion of judgment.
I completely agree with that, and would hasten to add that we need to make distinctions about different forms of judgment. So it's not a kind of judgment of episteme, to put it in Greek terms. That is, it's not a judgment that leads to scientific knowledge or is related to scientific knowledge. It's a kind of practical judgment, phronesis. It is distinct from calculation, if by calculation we mean something that can be calculated as true or false at the end of the process of calculation.
Right.
But keep in mind also that in ancient Greek, where the notion of phronesis comes from, there is a distinction between logos, which is reason in general, and dialectic as well, and to logistikon, which is where the word logistics comes from. And when we're talking about practical reason, the Greeks talk about to logistikon, and that means both calculation and judgment. So the distinction between judgment and calculation is very small in ancient Greek. And indeed, practical judgment is always calculative in some sense. In the technical sense, the sense of techne, what we might call today calculation. And in the phronetic sense, what we might call today judgment. The difference between the two in Greek is very small.
I think that's really important, and it's helpful in reminding us that phronesis is always tied to virtues in a really, really intimate way. So just to use the example that you used, I, of course, could calculate how to say something true. I could figure out the logistics of speaking the truth. I can't calculate how to be an honest person. To be an honest person requires habituation, a lot of practice, a lot of judgment in order to be able to determine in any particular situation what is going to be the most honest way of acting here, which, may or may not be telling the truth perfectly anyway. So I think that's really helpful. And I'm wondering if that's really what you're aiming for when you're saying we need to remember or recover this phronetic tradition, is we need to bring this back to virtue, basically.
Well, absolutely. I think the system of virtue is very important, but virtue can be understood in two ways. Okay, one is the sort of ineffectual way, which in my work I trace back to Stoicism, namely that honesty or not telling a lie is good in itself. And the sort of phronetic tradition, which would say, well, telling the truth is involved in a calculation that concerns the good. So if we say that truth is a good in itself, we can remember the debate between Kant and Constance. The question is posed to Kant, well, if you're at home harboring a friend who is running away from a murderer, and the murderer knocks on your door and asks you, is your friend inside, would you let me in to kill him? And if you're honest, Kant says, well, of course. You'll say, my friend is here. You're not going to lie. Whereas in the phronetic tradition, and here the reference will be to chapter 16 of the Tractatus Teleco-Politicus, Spinoza says, we have an inherent right to lie, to be dishonest. When does that happen? When a kind of contract is broken. So, his example is if you're stopped in the middle of the night by a highway robber and you promise them under duress to give them some money the next day, well, you have the right, if the circumstances change, not to carry on with your promise. You have the right, in other words, to say, well, I lied to you at that point. So the distinction then between the two notions of virtue is whether a virtue is good in itself, just like an action, playing tennis in Rick's example earlier, may be good in itself. That is the tradition of the ineffectual, or the tradition that says that virtue is discernible in its effects, and therefore it is subject to a kind of instrumental judgment that the Greeks called phronesis, and in the tradition we find other names as well.
We've had an episode on lying, and we talked a lot about Kant's essay on the supposed right to lie. If I'm a Kantian and I tell the truth and you ask me, why did you tell the truth? I have an easy answer. And my answer is, well, because I acted in such a way that the maximum of my action could be a universal moral law for all. But if I have this more complex notion of virtue, that, as you put it, a virtue is not good in itself, but in its effects, then when you come to me and you say, well, why did you do this? it seems to me I open myself also to you coming back and saying, well, that's wrong. You overlooked something, or that was the bad thing to do in this context. And so this way of thinking about ethics seems to bring us into a messy social and political world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my point against the tradition of the ineffectual would be, sure, you can always take the high moral ground by saying that's good in itself, that's honest in itself or whatever. But what about the effects of that good in itself? Like, what if the murderer gets in the house and kills your friend? Sure, you've taken the high moral ground, but then you have to dispose of the body. And I'm not really sure that that's a particularly moral thing to do, So that's one
And if
point.
you have a body on your hands, don't call a Kantian.
I mean, Kant was very aware of this issue, He feels sort of pressed at a point in the second critique to say, how do we see the moral law? How do we discern the moral law? He seems exasperated by his own internal questionnaire. He says, well, look outside the window, the gallows in the square. And that will remind you what the right thing to do is, where the moral law is. So it seems to me that despite the sort of appeal to a universal moral law, despite an appeal to something that is virtuous or moral in itself, the idea of the ineffectual, the sort of tradition of the ineffectual, as I call it, that tries to ground ethics on something that precedes effectivity and is outside effectivity and therefore outside any instrumental calculation, nonetheless employs instrumental calculation at a certain point in ways that deprive it of effectivity, deprive it of having any stake in what the outcome of our actions would be.
I wonder if it's the case that what actually happens is that what you're calling the ineffectual approach maybe loses its particular effectiveness in specific cases, but it still always maintains its universal effectiveness. And I know I've said this before on the podcast, but of course, Kant also wouldn't tell the murderer that his friend was in the house, but he would lie to the murderer. I mean, I assume he would. I hope he would. He would lie to the murderer, but he would then not turn around and raise his children that lying is good. Right? That's the point of that story. The lie remains the wrong thing to do, even when, in some circumstances, you choose another good. There's a conflict of duties here. You're not supposed to lie, but you're also, not supposed to use people as means to an end. In this case, I don't know, I suppose you could say to the end of like being a good, honest, moral person or helping out the murderer, whatever. That's not the point. The point here is that the effectiveness of the moral law remains effective universally. It doesn't have, as you are pointing out, the kind of particular effectiveness, the local effectiveness of the phronetic tradition. But I don't want us to caricature too much the effectiveness of what you're calling the ineffectual.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there is a very significant value in the tradition of the ineffectual, not only the Kantian sense, but Heideggerian and the whole tradition that came to be called continental philosophy. Let me perhaps go a step back, because I think I've talked about all these issues, especially the distinction between the phronetic and the ineffectual, as if I'm on the side of the phronetic, which I am. But there's also a larger problem here. And the larger problem can be framed this way. If we go to an absolutely fundamental philosophical question, namely, what is the question between being and acting? Or to put it differently, what is the question between ontology and ethics? Okay? Mm-hmm. Assuming that the notion of being or ontology is not carrying on this baggage of metaphysics, namely, it doesn't have transcendence in it. When we have a monist or materialist ontology, how can we say that certain things are good or bad? And this is a question that we can find throughout the tradition articulated in many different ways. Now, if you don't have a notion of transcendence that tells you that there's something outside being that tells you what is good and bad, then you're faced with a problem. Because if being is one, if there is nothing outside being, if being is a totality outside of which nothing exists, what Spinoza called God or nature, then what is the source of your ethical choices? How can you say that something is good or bad? Because whatever you do is within being. The distinction, the qualitative distinction between good and bad disappears. Now, this is a problem that we already find in antiquity. Like, for instance, Cicero's On Fate is on this problem. This is the problem that arises in the first response to Spinoza by Bale in his dictionary, and the notion of Spinozism that he develops is precisely the impossibility of having an answer to the question of how is it possible to have an ethics if you adopt a materialist monist ontology. Okay? And my argument is that in the tradition, going back to ancient philosophy, we can find two and only two responses to this problem. One is to say we can define virtue in terms of its effects, and that is the phronetic tradition. And the other response is the tradition of the ineffectual that starts with the Stoic school of philosophy, which says that virtue is something outside the effects that precedes and grounds any effects. And I think both these traditions are very significant. I don't want to devalue either of these traditions. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So to go to the phronetic, because I've been talking about the disadvantages of the ineffectual tradition, it seems to me that there is a major disadvantage of the phronetic tradition as well, which is the fact that because the means and the ends of our phronetic calculations can never be certain, this means that this can be taken up by people and manipulated, and we can be persuaded to do things that are against our good. And this is the problem of what we might call today populism. Why is it that a political leader persuades people to vote for him, even though he promises things that clearly would not be to their benefit, clearly won't be to their advantage? And I think that's the major problem of the phronetic tradition, the problem of voluntary servitude, or the way that Spinoza puts it in the preface to the Theological Political Treatise. Why is it that people act for the servitude as if they're acting for their salvation or their good? Yeah. So there are problems in both traditions, but I think it's really significant to remember both traditions because that gets us out of the problem of the critique of instrumental reason, as I was telling before, which in a sense leads us to forget the notion of phronesis.
I think that's very helpful. I also think that you're moving pretty quickly over a very slick rhetorical device that you're using here, which is to call the position opposed to the phronetic tradition ineffectual, as opposed to something else, non-instrumental, ideal. Why not just call it phronetic and ideal? Why is it phronetic and ineffectual? Because that's a value-laden term.
Oh, it is. I actually get the term from a specific source, namely Heidegger's letter on humanism.
Right.
There are certain expressions in German, ohne Wirkungen or ohne Effekte, which are translated as ineffectual, namely without effects. And I like to joke a little bit in my writings because, ineffectual both means without effects in the sense that Heidegger is describing in that very significant letter. I mean, he's calling to France, to Paris, and that's a very significant essay for subsequent French philosophy, as is documented by many books. Like the idea of what I call the ineffectual comes into continental philosophy. This is a major source, the letter on humanism. So that's why I use the term. And I also didn't want to use a specific articulation of the term, like, for instance, the Kantian one or the Heideggerian one or the Derridian one, because I want to make the broader argument that there is a tradition here, which we haven't given a name to because it hasn't been recognized as such, a tradition here that goes all the way back to Stoicism and has always the same structure to respond to what is the relation between ontology and ethics.
Yeah.
And the structure is that there must be some kind of action which precedes and grounds anything that we do precisely because it's outside effects. So I wanted to create a new concept to refer to that so that I can capture this whole tradition.
In a sense, that is the entree that Levinas opens up when he disturbs the primacy of ontology and puts ethics as first philosophy.
Oh, precisely. And I think Levinas is a good example, but also you will find very different articulations of the ineffectual throughout continental philosophy. So, for instance, what Derrida calls the unconditioned, which can be unconditional hospitality or justice or whatever, you see exactly the same structure. And that's why I want to create my own concept, because I think the other in Levinas and the unconditioned in Derrida or authenticity in Heidegger or whatever, like they're very different concepts. They approach the connection between being and acting in different ways. They emphasize different things. And yet, all of them, despite how the concept is built, they have the same structure, namely that in order to talk about action, we need to presuppose something, difference, for instance, in Derrida, which grounds and precedes acting because it's outside effects. Hence, I wanted a concept that captures that move, that characterizes a number of philosophers going all the way back to Stoicism.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar. There is a way in which hanging out at the end of Aristotle's story is a kind of ineffectuality. I have in mind the way he privileges theory at the end of the Ethics, and the way in which, in a sense, that puts the whole ethics on that kind of ineffectual ground. And from a Marxian point of view, I think one would have two problems with that are intimately connected. And the first is that to privilege the ineffectual in this dual sense of it has no effects and it does nothing, it has to come from a place within the division of labor in which my needs are already taken care of, right? Mm-hmm. And then that leads to the second, namely, that already presupposes a certain kind of class division. There are those who are able to do nothing, and then there must be those who do for the people who do nothing. I'm wondering if this Marxian way of thinking, also a materialist in orientation way of thinking, plays any role in your concern about privileging what you call the ineffectual.
Oh, I think in the 20th century, the rediscovery of the ineffectual by conservative thinkers, one of the sort of political positionings is to bypass Marxist thinking of the political and the economy, which they see as instrumental. So the critique of instrumentality in conservative thinkers in the first half of the 20th century is positioned, amongst other things, against Marxism. You know, we see the same thing in Hannah Arendt. Initially, The Human Condition was meant to be a book on Marx, and then when she abandons that project, does a typology of acting, one part of which she calls just action, pure and simple, is precisely a kind of action that is outside any effectivity, outside any calculation. So the ineffectual is positioned against Marxism, and that's actually a really good example of the point I was making before, that we can see in the tradition, if we start with an ontology that is materialist, that has no transcendence, that is non-metaphysical, that will have two and only two answers to the question of how to have an ethics. One is the ineffectual, and the other is the phronetic, because it's actually pretty easy to see that Marx operates on the phronetic tradition.
Right.
We can approach that in many different ways. For instance, the notion of interest that we find in the Communist Manifesto is the competition between two kinds of interest, the interest of the bourgeoisie and the interest of the proletariat. And then we can mobilize political economy type analysis to analyze this. Let's not forget the notion of interest, which comes from Scottish Enlightenment. This is precisely how Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, for instance, in his theory of moral sentiments, that's how he talks about the Epicurean notion of phronesis.
That's right.
He translates it into a discourse of interest. Mm-hmm. So there is a very direct linguistic link of the notion of phronesis, as I describe it, and the phronetic tradition that arises again in a very different form in Marxism, translated now into the concept of interest. So that's what I was trying to say before when I was saying that I want to sort of point out the great variety and in many ways contradicting conceptions of both the phronetic and the ineffectual within the history of philosophy. There are many different articulations, but it is important. We need to recognize that if we start with a monist materialist ontology, these are the two options. What happens if we look at ethics and politics from this choice that we have between the phronetic and the ineffectual. That's like very much a motivating factor in the books that I'm writing.
I want to ask you a question that I think will be helpful for our listeners who might think that we're getting a little too deep in the weeds here. If we start with a monist ontology, there's nothing outside of being. There's no transcendence. This is fully immanent ontology. I think a lot of people would say that it must be the case that everything that is necessary. Therefore, there's no freedom, and you just quite simply can't have ethics and politics without freedom. So I want to give you a chance to explain to our listeners whether or not you think there is freedom, why it might be important to reconceive an immanent ontology that still can retain ethics and politics without having to fall back on these transcendental cheat codes, as you seem to be suggesting.
I think this is an excellent question, and it's really the question that brings freedom to the prominence of the ethical and political discourse in the 19th century. And again, a major motivating factor for that was the debates about Spinoza in the late 19th century with Jacobi, and Jacobi reinterprets and resents yet again the kind of critique of Spinozism that we find in Bale. Namely, if you don't have some notion of transcendence, how is it possible to say that one action is good and one action is bad? You're fully determined. You lack freedom, And we see this idea articulating itself in many different ways as well. So, for instance, the notion of existentialist angst. There is nothing transcendent to hang my hat on and say, this action is good and this action is bad. Well, if I'm walking on the beach, whether I kill an Arab or not makes no difference. Everything is the same. We see that in our political discourse. If there is no principles that tell us that something is good or bad, well, whether we vote for one party or the other, ultimately it makes no difference. There is most certainly that discourse that unless we have a robust notion of freedom that returns back to the individual and the individual free will, we cannot have an ethical system. I fully recognize that discourse, and if you hold that position, you'll have to hold an ontology that includes transcendence. My response to that discourse would be, again, going back to antiquity, where that discourse is discussed, to say that freedom is not an ethical or political virtue for the ancients. We don't find freedom as a virtue in ancient ethics. Why? Because freedom is defined in a very precise way in antiquity. Freedom is freedom from the idea that the only kind of causes that determine us are, in Cicero's words from his book on fate or fatalism, freedom is the idea that there is not only antecedent causes or natural causes that determine us. We also can make certain calculations about the effects of our actions. And why is that? Because we'll never know all causes that determine us. We can never be fully conditioned, to put it in Kantian terms, if we understand conditioned from an epistemological kind of perspective. So we're free from that reduction of our actions to a kind of idealist conception that we're conditioned externally only insofar as we understand how we're conditioned. And then if we get rid of freedom in the sense of the free will, where suddenly can make decisions that are completely independent, if we get rid of that idea of the free will, then we have to have a different basis for understanding ethics and politics. Okay? I'm advocating then for an ethics and politics where freedom is not a central concept, or freedom of the will is not a central concept. And that's in line, for instance, with a Spinozan conception of freedom. Moira Gatens and Genevieve Lloyd, in their book on Spinoza, they describe their freedom as freedom from the free will.
That's right, yeah.
That was a very influential idea for me, which I've worked on quite a lot. Like my book on Kafka looks at Kafka as a comic writer in the sense that all the jokes that he makes are about the free will and the absurdities of the free will.
But in this sense, then, what you referred to earlier as the problem of action now seems to be an epistemological problem. That is, the reason why we should struggle over the ineffectual versus the phronetic, why we might want to champion the phronetic and so on, is simply because we don't know the ways in which we're determined, and we also don't know the outcomes of our actions. But by the way, even if we did know the outcomes of our actions, we couldn't choose otherwise.
Well, in a sense, I agree with that. It is an epistemological problem too, but I would argue that the sort of modern separation of epistemology, ontology, ethics, and so on and so forth, that is challenged by the monist materialism that I'm referring to. For the ancient Greeks, the ethical, the ontological, and the epistemological are not separated. So when I'm talking about being fascinated by the history of how ontology and ethics, or being in action, come to be thought together, how their relation is thought to be within the philosophical tradition, this is not to exclude other branches of philosophy. It's just to say that you cannot privilege one of these sides. The question about what is and how we exist in what is includes every branch of thought. That's significant. And if that is the case, then why privilege the epistemological? Why say that, in order to have any semblance of well-being, in order to escape existentialist angst, we need to have a free will, which presupposes that we can make judgments as individuals, whether these are described in epistemological terms or whatever terms you want to describe them. Some judgments as individuals within our mind about how to act, and that is the kind of register of our freedom. That says to me, we're separating different discourses that don't need to be separated.
But why wouldn't arriving at the position that you just described, why wouldn't that be the consequence, the effect of a certain calculation about several different questions at once, epistemological questions, moral questions, political questions?
Indeed. And that would mean that philosophy is a practical matter, and I completely agree with that.
Right. I assumed that you were going to say that was the case.
You're reading my mind.
Maybe to connect the dots, aren't you saying then that what you're calling the ineffectual, the tradition of the ineffectual, is itself a phronetic tradition?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I think there's two main arguments against the ineffectual. One is that it's ineffective for the reasons I described before. And the second argument that is self-contradictory. In matter of fact, it presupposes the phronetic whether it wants it or not.
Right.
And, from that point of view, I think it's worth remembering that in antiquity, the main philosophical battle, the battle lines, are between Epicureans and Stoics.
Right.
The Platonic Academy, the Aristotelians are not as significant from a certain point onwards. And why is that? I think it's because the fault line is between whether we can think of virtue in terms of its effects or outside effectivity, and what are the arguments for one or the other. And I think one of the main arguments against the Stoic position that thinks as virtue in itself is to say, well, it's never in itself. It always has certain effects, and therefore it is always phronetic. Paradoxically, and I think this is actually worth pondering for those really wedded to the critique of instrumental reason, this is mutatis mutandi, precisely the critique of instrumental reason. When Heidegger and Adorno say any form of technicity presupposes structures of power, well, that's perfectly correct. But it doesn't follow. Therefore, we can step outside that realm of effectivity.
Right.
Because everything is indeed structured by forms of calculation.
So the way that you're describing this forgetting of phronesis and the phronetic tradition brings us around to a question of power, and that is, how does the ineffectual tradition usurp the position of phronesis in ethics after the ancients? I mean, what accounts for the fact that it needs to be recovered and displaced from the way in which philosophy has developed since the ancients?
Before you answer that, can I piggyback on the first part of that question? Because that actually was similar to what I was going to ask as well. And really, it's a historical point. You've been describing this evolution of these two separate traditions, going from the ancients and then directly to the modern and contemporary period, and skipping, to me, what is the thing that actually usurped the phronetic tradition that you're describing, which is the advent of the Abrahamic tradition, the most important, perhaps, institution of the transcendental ontology. So when you answer, David, if you could also just slide that in there too, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's where I was intending to go.
We are really mind melding, Dimitris.
We are really each other's minds right now, yeah. In my account, there's two fundamental historical points where the ineffectual comes to dominate. One is, we've already discussed it Kantianism and transcendental idealism, and the other is Judeo-Christian metaphysics. And the example I like to give as a kind of exhibit A about this point, I mean, there will be many examples, but I think the most telling example is Augustine's chapter 19 from The City of God. The most explicit engagement Augustine has with ancient philosophy. And how does he do the engagement with ancient philosophy? He refers to a system of ends, to a system of calculations that was developed by Pharaoh in antiquity. And he presents it with great precision and great respect, which is not always the case with Augustine when he picks up a polemic. And he essentially describes the phronetic tradition. Then he says, well, if you want to be a Christian, you can't subscribe to this tradition because this tradition reduces the ethical to this world, and this world is a world of misery. And we need to realize that in order to get out of this world of misery, we need to posit another world, which points to the city of God. The ethical principles that govern this different world are very simple. There are two principles. There are the love of God and the love of the neighbor, what came to be called in Latin caritas. These principles are outside this world of material reality. These principles are outside natural causality. Love of God and love of neighbor. I would say that this is a really significant political moment for the prevailing of the ineffectual. Now, when I say this point, the question that I always get is, you've contradicted yourself. Because you said that the phronetic and the ineffectual are the two ways in which we can respond. And I will say, you haven't read my book on Spinoza. Because I think Spinoza is really, really good at that.
Always be selling, Dimitris. Always be selling.
Absolutely. I will provide a discount code as well. I'll ask my publisher for a discount code only for the listeners of the hotel bar sessions. But the point that Spinoza makes is that any kind of ontology that has recourse to transcendence, that's really the first 6 chapters of the Tractatus Theologo-Politicus, is really presupposing a monist ontology whether he wants it or not.
Right.
He uses irony to say that. For instance, he says at one point, Moses going up to Mount Sinai to be closer to God in order to communicate with him. I mean, that's ridiculous. Even if you understand God as transcendent, you're not going to go closer to him if you go up to Mount Sinai.
You just get better reception up there.
Maybe they had better microphones, But when I say we'll start with the monist materialist ontology, the point is not that there is another ontology, an ontology of transcendence. But in fact, the ontology of transcendence is presupposed as one version, a mistaken version of a monist materialist ontology. And it seems really significant to me that the ontology of transcendence leans on the ineffectual tradition only, not on the phronetic tradition.
I have an actually very practical question that I would like to ask you, and that is, how do you teach an ethics class now?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't teach ethics as such, but it seems to me it's very important to understand that certain set dichotomies that we take for granted in ethics, for instance, deontology versus utilitarianism, or compatibilism versus incompatibilism, need to be questioned. Just to give an example, if we're talking about deontology versus consequentialism, deontology clearly belongs to the ineffectual tradition. You have certain principles or values that govern action which are themselves not part of, to put in Kantian terms again, natural causality. Okay, so the opposite is meant to be utilitarianism. But isn't utilitarianism also presupposing that for the calculation of the greatest good, you have to have a calculus that is itself outside experience, it is itself outside calculation? So, in fact, I would say that the consequentialist tradition belongs to the tradition of the ineffectual because it still posits something that is outside experience. Or to put it in a different way, anything that is not understanding ethics and politics in a performative sense or in a queer sense, and there is nothing much queer about utilitarianism or performativity about utilitarianism, I guess. Anything that is not performative and queer belongs to the ineffectual tradition. So if that is correct, then it does indeed pose a big challenge to how the curriculum, what an ethics course in a university department would look like.
So listeners can't have seen this, but when he said an ethics course, he put big scare quotes around it.
That's right.
So I suppose my next question would be, then do you think maybe the enterprise of teaching ethics courses or political theory courses in philosophy is just ill-advised, that we should rather be teaching only ontology courses.
Oh, absolutely not. I'm interested in teaching philosophy. Whether that is branded metaphysics or is branded political philosophy or is branded ethics, there is a very modern notion to separate these disciplines. Separation starts in medieval times, but the splintering that we see is an effect of the 19th century, which has to do with the development of the institution of the university. And maybe I just want to teach philosophy. I don't want to teach ethics or ontology or metaphysics. What would it be like if people were to think philosophically as opposed to thinking about epistemology, as opposed to thinking about moral theory and so on and so forth? It seems to me that that's more likely to be appealing to someone who calls themselves a continental philosopher as opposed to an analytic philosopher. An analytic philosopher at this point will freak out because they would say, hey, how can we possibly have a well-articulated philosophical question unless that question is articulated within the terms that we have in moral philosophy or metaphysics or whatever kind of genre, scare quotes again, kind of genre we want to employ. But I think to be a consistent monist materialist, you have to say you're doing philosophy. You're not doing ethics, epistemology, and whatever.
Totally agree.
I'm pretty sure that the analytic philosophers would have freaked out way before that.
Oh, I think they've logged out by now, long before,
Hey listeners, this is Lee, just stepping in here with one last update before we wrap things up in this episode. And that's to let you all know that we have decided that we are making the move away from Twitter, X, and to bluer skies. So if you have in the past followed us on Twitter, please note that we're going to be moving away from that platform and moving more of our content onto Blue Sky. That's both the podcast and our co-hosts. The good thing is that you can find us on Blue Sky using basically the same handles. @Hotel Bar Podcast is our handle on Blue Sky, and under that you'll see the handles of our co-hosts. Please join us in making this move. We look forward to seeing you there.
What I want to say is a little bit unfair because I've seen more recent aspects of your thinking about this, namely what you call agonistic politics. And it seems to me that your thinking in that direction is partly an answer to Lee's question, in that this approach to action that is a philosophical approach and not merely just an ethical approach, but takes in epistemology and politics and metaphysics and so on, uniquely leads to a way of being human in which we are working this out with one another together, sometimes in a more antagonistic relation with one another. But that's what ethics and politics looks like. It looks like striving to live together well.
Oh, absolutely. And the project is called the agonistic condition. And the reason that it's called the agonistic condition is as a reference to Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition. Mm-hmm. So when I refer to agonism, I refer to the ontology of the human that Hannah Arendt is referring to. But there is also a very polemical element. It's probably the most polemical book that I've written. So the notion of agonism is kind of incorporated or circumscribed within the book itself. Basically, the argument is that if we look at the notion of agonism as it has developed the last 30 years or so, it's a relatively new concept that comes from political theory, right? And that notion of agonism is developed in conversation with continental philosophy. And if we look at all the different theories of agonistic politics or an agonistic democracy, all of them, and I go through various examples, William Connolly, Chantal Mouffe, more recent ones like antagonistic politics in Oliver Markert, which I regard as a very significant thinker, but all of them invariably in different ways have recourse to the ineffectual. At some point, they have recourse to the notion of action and ethics outside affectivity. For instance, Hannah Arendt is a very good example of that. The notion of action, that is an action without effects. So I'm trying to say that if we are to have a robust notion of agonism, we actually need to return back to the phronetic tradition, because the very idea of agonism as a concept that is to describe our human condition, to speak with Arendt again, goes back to a fundamental characteristic of phronesis, namely that phronetic calculations that we make are never certain. And that is the source, not of the good, because the good can never be defined with certainty, but the way in which we interact with each other. And that interaction is premised on a fundamental disagreement. We can never know for certain what the end of our actions, the good, is, to include the other ethically, but also we can never know for certain what the means are at our disposal to achieve that end. So I want to describe the human condition, if you want to put it that way, through an agonistic vocabulary and the conception of how we interact with each other because we disagree, because we're in a state of conflict, without recourse to the ineffectual, as is the case in the discourse of agonistic democracy that has developed in the last 30 years.
You kind of circled back to something you said earlier. Earlier, you said one of the dangers of what you call the phronetic tradition is that, yes, the critique of instrumental reason was right. It could be manipulated. It could be used in ways in which power is taken out of our hands and so on. But now you come back around and you say, okay, yes, that might be the case, but also this phronetic tradition is the only possibility for democracy, that any recourse to the ineffectual is going to be inherently anti-democratic. Before you talked about the danger, but here now you're pointing out, yes, that the danger still exists and maybe is unavoidable, but it's a danger that exists and is unavoidable in the very pursuit of democracy itself.
I completely agree with that. I think democracy is a very dangerous concept. Not in the negative sense.
Right.
You know, I think something that Jacques Derrida says, namely that the greatest threat to democracy is democracy itself. That's the idea that goes back to the discourse, for instance, of voluntary servitude, as I said before. Why is it that people choose to support a political power? It can be a person of one or many or whatever, that doesn't cater for the good. And I think that's very pertinent following the November elections.
You know, just a few days after the election, the comedian Jon Stewart made this comment, which I think he probably intended to be a little bit of a salve for people who felt like they had just fallen into the pit of despair after the election. And also a reminder that elections are not really where democracy happens. He made a comment that the work of democracy is, he called it a lunch pail job, that there are millions of people showing up every day, making little actions, calculating a million different bureaucratic structures to try to get something done, and then going back and recalculating their way through those bureaucratic structures to try to make sure it did get done. And then they get up the next day and they just do it again forever, right? Like that's it. And it seems to me that in a way captures the picture of ethics and politics that you're giving us here. It's a lunch pail job. It's a lot of local calculations. And to the extent that we want to, as you said earlier, hang our hat on something like the presidential election that only happens once every 4 years, or congressional elections that only happen once every 2 years, that we're really missing where ethics and politics actually happen.
At one level, I completely agree with you, Leigh. At one level, democracy is indeed, in my terminology, the agonistic condition, the fact that when we interact, that interaction presupposes a certain element of conflictuality. Therefore, every action that we undertake has the charged element, democratic element in it, as you put it. However, I will add one thing, and I think it's very important, and I will confess that I've changed my mind over the years about that. It seems to me that this continuous democracy idea can lead either to a radical anarchism, hey, fuck institutions, because they cancel out that continuous democracy element. And I admit that for a long time, I was on that camp, for a very long time. Or you can go the statist commitment and say, well, in fact, institutions matter. However these are articulated, there is no ideal set of institutions. Still, institutions matter. The way we interact in our everyday level is important, but the way we interact and is mediated by certain structures of power that are legislated into institutions also matters. And I think for me, it was really Spinoza that taught me that you have to be an institutionalist in order to belong to the phronetic tradition. Because it seems to me that anarchism is a cop-out. Anarchism can lead to nihilism, can lead to that idea of, look, whatever you do, it doesn't matter. It's always the same. So I'm a statist, and I think, sure, every action that we undertake has that democratic charge that you're describing. But let's not forget that institutions matter. And I think Hannah Arendt is really good at that as well. I mean, there is an idea of our actions kind of structure the way that we relate to each other. But hey, let's not forget the realm of the political, the constitution and the role that the constitution plays and so on.
Well, I hate to be the one that says it, but unfortunately our bartender has made last call.
What an appeal to transcendence.
She's asking us to calculate the judgment to get the hell out of here ASAP. So, Dimitris, this has just been a really fantastic conversation, and I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Hear, hear.
The pleasure was mine, and it's always great to have a conversation accompanied by a nice drink.
Indeed, and you're welcome back for another anytime.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.